Hi everyone, and welcome to the third of your migration revision videos. This one is going to focus on the 18th and 19th century, so what I call the industrial period, because it's when the Industrial Revolution is taking place, the period that stretches from 1700 to 1900. So the key context that you need to know for this period is that number one, the Industrial Revolution is taking place. So factories powered by coal are providing jobs. That has a massive beneficial impact on the economy, and it massively grows urban areas. So you get towns and cities with much bigger populations. And the creation of things like factories provides a huge amount of job opportunities. So that's a really important pull factor for pretty much every migrant group in this period. As I said, there's new technology with the Industrial Revolution which provides job opportunities, but it also creates new forms of transport that make it much easier and faster and safer to migrate. So especially the steamship brings a lot of migration from further away, places like Asia, places like India. It's easier to travel from with the steamship. Another factor at this time is that the British Empire is continuing to grow, and parts of the West Indies or Caribbean, India, and parts of Africa are controlled by Britain at this time. So we're going to see continued African, Indian, and West Indian migration because of that. Another change that's a really important pull factor is that during this period, especially in the 1800s, Parliament and the British government is becoming much more democratic. Middle class and then later on working class men get the vote. Restrictions on religious minorities were removed, and generally it's a period of increased political freedom. So that's another pull factor, another reason to come to Britain. So things like Catholic emancipation in 1829, which allows Catholics to be MPs. Things like the 1832 and 1867 Reform Acts increase the right to vote. And those are all reasons to migrate to Britain in this period. The migration that we see in this period is from some groups we've seen before. We've seen Asian migration before, we've seen African migration before, we've seen German and Italian migration in the medieval period with the Hansa merchants and the Lombards, but one new group at this time that we haven't really looked at before is Irish migrants who come in huge numbers during this time. So we're going to start with Irish because they're one of the groups that we look at in most detail in the industrial period, and we're, as always, going to start with the causes of migration, so the reasons that they leave Ireland and the reasons that they come to England and Scotland. The first one is religious discrimination. The majority of Irish migrants that we look at are Catholics, and in Ireland a Protestant minority is in control of the area. They have most of the land, most of the wealth, and they tend to discriminate against Irish Catholics. So very high rents from landlords, very poor job opportunities. So that is a clear push factor, a reason to leave Ireland. There's also changes to politics at this time. In 1800, this law is passed called the Act of Union, which officially makes Ireland part of the UK. There are other laws like the ones we've just mentioned that are increasing freedom at this time. So Catholic Emancipation Act allows Catholics, and as we've said, majority of Irish migrants are Catholic, to vote and be MPs. And these laws give Irish Catholics full equal rights to Protestants in England. So that is a pull factor, a reason to go to England. As I said, the Industrial Revolution is the key context for this whole time. Ireland only had one industrialised city, Belfast, so they only have one city that has this new technology and has these factories, whereas obviously England is industrialising very quickly. So in Ireland you have very few good jobs available. Weaving jobs, which had been a really important part of their economy, are dying out, whereas in England, because of the Industrial Revolution, there are loads of factories which have job opportunities, and also that creates business opportunities. You might want to set up your own factory. So you have the push factor of a lack of industrialisation in Ireland and the pull factor of industrialisation in England. Finally, got to be the most important reason when we're talking about Irish migration specifically, is the potato famine. Potatoes had been the kind of main staple food in Ireland, and in 1845 this big famine hits that kills 1/3 of the crop. The following year the entire crop fails, so all of the potatoes are just mouldy, they're inedible, and the whole situation is made much worse by the British government, who refused to allow Ireland to keep its other crops and forced Ireland to keep selling them abroad. All of that culminates to create a situation where 1 million people are dying of starvation, and that leads to 2 million Irish people migrating. So if you're evaluating the different causes of migration, the fact that that leads to 2 million Irish migrating clearly shows it's the most important reason. And that is obviously a push factor, a very clear reason to leave Ireland, because there are people literally starving to death because they're unable to get food. So, as ever, our second key question is how people were treated and the experience they had. And our third key question is the impact they have. I've combined these together because there's a big overlap in how the Irish are treated and the impact they have on the country. So we're going to focus on what life was like for them, and it's largely negative experience. We see poor job opportunities. They work as navvies, navigational engineers, building roads, railway and canals, but that's generally low paid, very dangerous work. The death rate was very high for people working in that profession. Many Irish joined the army, so we see 55,000 Irish soldiers in the army at this time, but again, pretty poor pay, pretty poor conditions, and highly dangerous. In terms of living conditions, they lived in large urban areas like Liverpool, which is our case study we'll look at in a minute, and London, and they tend to have dirty, overcrowded condition where diseases spread really easily. You see massive outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid at this time. The final factor affecting their experience is that there's very negative social attitudes. Because of very, very long term, we're talking centuries of political conflict between England and Ireland, there's a lot of anti-Irish hate in England. This gets worse in the industrial period when extreme Irish nationalists, called Fenians, who were people who wanted Irish independence, started using violence to try and achieve their aims. It's basically like an early form of terrorism, some people might call it, and that worsens anti-Irish hate. The Irish were then stereotyped as dangerous or a burden on society, and you get events taking place like the Murphy Riots. The Murphy Riots take place in Birmingham in 1867. Irish people, homes and businesses are attacked after an anti-Catholic protester makes this big speech stirring up the crowd against the Irish, and it turns into violence. So remember, violence is a theme of the course that we see in several different people's experience in several different periods. So you can compare that violence against the Irish to other examples of violence that we see in the early modern and medieval periods. You can compare that to things like the Notting Hill riots in the modern period. You can compare that to things like the attacks during the Peasants' Revolt or the evil May Day riot in the medieval period. So clearly, negative experience for Irish migrants. In terms of their impact, and we'll be able to get into that impact in more detail when we look at the case study of Liverpool, we can already see some immediate impacts of Ireland on Britain. So we can see political impact through the role of individual figures like Fergus O'Connor, who was a Chartist, which was someone who protested for working class rights. He's also a member of Parliament in this period, and he sets up a radical newspaper called the Northern Star. So you have immediately there an example of political impact from Irish migration, and then we'll see other examples of economic, political and social impact in the case study for this period, which is Liverpool. So, getting into the first case study, there are two in this period. The specific reasons that people from Ireland migrate to Liverpool are that number one, is quite close to Ireland geographically. Number two, it had links to America, and lots of Irish people planned to go to England and then go to America from there. And Liverpool has many job opportunities. It has a lot of international trade because it's a port city. It has a lot of cotton trading. So there are job opportunities there that they can't necessarily get in Ireland. So we see a huge amount of migration to the point where they become 20% of the population in Liverpool. We obviously especially see that migration in the late 1840s and 1850s after the potato famine hits Ireland. Largely, as we've seen, the situation in Liverpool is the same as the rest of the country, and that is quite a negative experience. There's very overcrowded accommodation, there's poor housing, and there's big disease outbreaks that take place, like outbreaks of typhus. We also see negative attitudes towards migrants in Liverpool, especially because so many Irish migrants migrate at once, and that tends to lead to a backlash. They were stereotyped very negatively as lazy and a burden on the welfare systems. They were seen as dangerous and they were seen as criminal, and as a result, they're very harassed by the police. So, over half of the cases that went to criminal court in 1850 in Liverpool, i.e., half of the people accused of crimes, were Irish. We also see quite poor job opportunities. We'll see in a minute a few individual examples of people with successful businesses, but generally 80% of men were manual labourers, so doing quite unskilled work, building docks as navvies or unloading goods off the ships as lumpers. Generally very hard for Irish women to find work, so they tended to work in domestic jobs. 80% of women were maids in people's households, obviously not very well paid positions, working basically as servants. We do, however, see some individual examples of positive experiences, especially later on in the period. So you get some political figures like T.P. O'Connor, who was the MP for Liverpool for a full 45 years, who was of Irish heritage. You get city council members who were Irish. You get the mayor of Liverpool, Samuel Robert Graves, who was of Irish heritage, and his home is where the Liverpool Football Club gets its name from, Anfield. We also see examples of successful businessmen of Irish heritage. So Robert Kane set up a brewery, which makes beer, in London. He owned about 200 pubs, which made him one of Britain's richest men at the time. His son became a baron in the House of Lords, so seeing that economic success turning into political success. Generally, the Irish are contributing economically to Liverpool by building the docks and doing some skilled work like repairing ships. We also just see many examples of smaller businesses in Liverpool who were Irish: butchers, bakers, tailors, lots of pubs that were set up by Irish migrants like the Shenanigans pub in the port. And you get social impact as well. People like Kitty Wilkinson, she was an Irish charity worker who campaigned for public health. She was known as the Saint of the Sums for all the help that she gave people. Something like the Scouse accent, which we still see in Liverpool today, has been influenced by the Irish accent. And looking at more modern impact, the Beatles, who are one of Britain's most famous pop music groups, were descended from Irish migrants. So you can see there political, economic, and social impact on Liverpool specifically, but then having a wider impact on Britain. However, Liverpool is not just a case study for Irish migration. Because it's a port city, a city on the coast which has lots of trade, we actually see a really diverse range of migrants coming to Liverpool at this time. So we're just going to quickly run through those as other examples you can use. You get increased African migration at this time, working as sailors for shipping companies, trading things like palm oil that was used to make soap. You get Indian migration. We've seen that in the previous period with the Lascars and the Ayers, and we see the same thing, Indian sailors coming on steamships as part of the East India Company trade or other trades with India like spices, silks. You also get at this time a really significant increase in Chinese migration. At this time, Britain has colonized Hong Kong, which is in China, and that's really increased the silk, cotton, and tea trade. and that's led to an increase of Chinese migration at this time, and you see a large Chinese population in Liverpool. So we can see, if we had to sum up, the big cause for these groups is trade. Might be different trades, but that is the thing that's bringing them all to Liverpool. In terms of experience, it's pretty similar to the Irish migration in that we do see quite a negative experience for most of them. In terms of African migration, they experience much worse wages and conditions. They have to deal with racist attitudes that were actually getting worse at this time. Indian migrants again tended to have worse wages and conditions than white workers. We have some signs of acceptance, so we see examples of intermarriage where Indian people were marrying English people. We also see some evidence of religious freedom, so Liverpool has a mosque that opens in 1890, which shows that Muslims were able to freely practice their religion in Liverpool. In terms of Chinese migration, they actually had a fairly positive reputation compared to some of the other groups we look at, and especially compared to the Irish. They were seen as being quite sober, so not drinking a lot. They were seen as hard workers who ran their businesses well. So that experience is, I would say, still on the negative side, but slightly more mixed. And when it comes to the impact, that's definitely largely economic, which is no surprise when trade is the reason that brings them there. The African migrants are involved in the shipping companies and in the trade, especially of palm oil and soap. Indian migrants are also involved in shipping companies and trade, and some Indian migrants set up businesses in Liverpool like lodging houses, curry houses. And Chinese migrants are also involved in the shipping companies and the trades, especially the silk trade. And we can see them setting up homes and businesses in Liverpool because Liverpool has the oldest Chinatown in Europe, where you would see lots of Chinese shops and cafes. As I said, the impact's largely economic, but I want to just throw in this political example. This is John Archer, and he had a father from Barbados and a mother from Ireland, so bringing together some of our different migrant groups there. He's born in Liverpool, but he moves to London and he becomes mayor of Battersea, which makes him Britain's first black elected politician. So with him, we do have an example of political impact linked to Liverpool, but also obviously generally affecting the country. So we've looked at Irish migration in detail. The next migrant group I want to look at specifically is African migration. Now, the key cause for African migration at this time that we learn is the slave trade, but you need to be very clear that the slave trade is not directly bringing people from Africa to Britain. What it's doing is forcing migration from Africa to North America and the Caribbean, and it's from there, from North America, that some African migrants are freed and some escape, and then they come to Britain for freedom, because in Britain slavery was not legal and they would be protected if they came into the country. In terms of their experience, it's quite varied. There are some positives and successes, but also negatives at this time. By 1800, there's about 15,000 Africans or people of African heritage living in England's towns and cities. And a bit like we see in the early modern period with the Black Tudors, their experiences really varied according to their class, job, and wealth. There is significant racism at this time, and some of the evidence suggests that racism in this period is actually worse than in the earlier periods, but you will still see some positive experiences. So, for example, Dido Elizabeth Bell was an upper-class gentlewoman who was mixed race at this time. Ignatius Sancho, who we'll come to again in a minute, was a wealthy businessman. He was a music composer, and he was actually wealthy enough to be able to vote in Britain's elections at a time when many white men couldn't actually do that and no women could. And finally, the Somerset case, and this links to the cause that we just talked about and slavery not being legal in Britain. James Somerset had been enslaved in the Caribbean, and he'd been brought to Britain by his master, and he had escaped. and his master was basically trying to kidnap him to return him to the Caribbean, where he would be considered a slave again. And he takes this case to court with the help of some abolitionists, and the judge in the court case decides, or he confirms, that enslaved people are free on arrival in Britain, and that James Somerset was a completely free man. So that is an example of that positive experience compared to where they've come from, and it also links to the causes of migration, because that Somerset case confirmed that Britain would be a place of freedom for enslaved people. It's not all positives though. As I said, there is significant racism at this time, and lots of black people in Britain are living in poverty, to the extent that a organisation has to be set up called the Committee for the Relief of Black Poor to try and help them with jobs and food and places to live. In terms of impact, we really focus on the political impact of African migrants at this time, specifically on how they contribute to the abolition of the slave trade. The slave trade is abolished in Britain in 1807, and then slavery itself is abolished in Britain from 1833. And we see several African migrants contributing to that. Sancho, who we've already mentioned, wrote letters and articles about his experiences of enslavement. Equiano, who had been, like Sancho, enslaved as a child and gained freedom as an adult, joined an abolitionist group called the Sons of Africa. He wrote an autobiography of his life story and the horrors of enslavement that he's experienced as a child and younger man. And in both those cases, their accounts of slavery really revealed to people the horrors of the situation and turned them against slavery and really encouraged the push for abolition. It's not all completely to do with abolition though. If you look at the example of William Coffey, who was a Chartist leader, as I said, Fergus O'Connor was an Irish Chartist leader. Here we see a black Chartist leader who was someone who campaigned for the rights of the working class. He was leader of the Chartists in London, and the Chartists in London were literally known as the black man and his party because of the importance of William Coffey's role to them. Okay, the next group we're going to look at is Asian migrants. We're mainly going to focus on Indian migration because that, like in the early modern period, is the main Asian migration that we see. But as has already been mentioned, we're also seeing increases in migration from China at this time. Trade, as with the early modern period, is a key cause here. They are migrating with the East India Company and then other trades with India and China. The British Empire and the changes to the British Empire are also an important factor here. India officially becomes part of the British Empire in the 1850s, and that's when we start to see Indian princes who have lost their land moving to London, and just a general increase in the connection between India and Britain. As mentioned already, war with and colonization of parts of China increased Chinese migration. The colonization of Hong Kong after the Opium Wars increases Chinese migration, and that's also a development in the empire. We also see Indian students coming this time to study at British universities, especially coming to study law. So that's a key difference with the previous period when we saw mainly migration from India because of trade, and now we're seeing it for other reasons like politics and education. Finally, as I've said, this is really the background cause for everyone in this period: industrialization, creation of things like steamships, and the buildings of the Suez Canal, which cut across the top of Africa and meant that instead of sailing all the way around the bottom of Africa, you could cut across the top, make the journey significantly easier. So those are the reasons for increased migration, and some are the same and some are different from the previous period, but the experience is largely the same as the early modern period. Lascars and Ayers struggle to find work and end up being unemployed or doing poorly paid manual labour. Similarly, the Ayers are abandoned and end up living in poverty. There are charities set up to help them. You can see in the photograph the example of the Ayers home set up by the London City Mission. And on the one hand, it's positive that a charity is set up to help them, but it's obviously a negative that they need charity in the first place. Do remember you can use Liverpool for Asian migration as well, which has a strong Asian community. But overall, quite a negative experience. In terms of impact, there's a clear economic impact. The manual labour that they work on contributes to building projects like the Manchester Ship Canal, as well as other canals, railways, bridges. Some Asian migrants are able to build successful businesses, and again, you can use the case study Liverpool as an example here. And you can also see some political examples in the elections of the first Indian MPs right at the end of this period. So again, always with migration, think about the comparisons you can make between different groups and different time periods. We've looked at so far examples of Irish MPs at this time, Indian MPs at this time, and later on we're also going to see Jewish MPs for the first time in the 18th and 19th centuries. Germans and Italians I've put together because lots of their causes of migration are quite similar. There are a few unique ones. So political freedom was a pull factor for German political thinkers who wanted to be able to express their views without fear. Your key example here is Karl Marx, who writes the Communist Manifesto. He's German, but he comes to Britain and writes that book there. Another key cause that's unique to the German migrants is that in the early 1700s, a new King of England is needed, and they have to ask George I to come from Germany, where he'd grown up, to be King of England. He obviously favours Germans, bring lots of German nobility with him when he comes, so that's a key political reason for German migration. On the Italian side, unique to Italian migration is outbreaks of disease in Italy at this time, especially typhus and cholera, so some people are moving to Britain to avoid those. And another issue that Italy has is that there is problems with farming. Lots of people are jobless and living in poverty, especially because Italy is not industrialized. One thing that they both have in common is that in both Germany and Italy at this time there is war and conflict going on as both countries go through unification. So previously, Germany and Italy had been lots of separate states with lots of separate leaders, and now they're both becoming one country of Germany, one country of Italy, and the process of that had created conflict, and to avoid that conflict, some of them have moved to Britain. And as ever, the Industrial Revolution is a key cause in this period. Britain has industrialized before Germany and before Italy, so Britain has many more job and business opportunities. As we'll see, especially for the Germans, lots of successful businesses are started by German migrants in Britain. In terms of their experiences and their impact, again, I've put those together because they do overlap a lot. The experience of Germans is really quite positive. It's one of the few genuinely positive experiences that we see in this period. They are working a variety of jobs and businesses. Some of those businesses are very successful. Italians is a bit more mixed. They do have some successful businesses and economic success, but many more of them struggle to find good jobs and do low paid work like manual labour, like the Irish, like some of the Asian migrants. Some of them are street musicians. And we tend to see that they're not integrating as much. They have quite separate communities, so you hear of like little Italies growing up at this time. And again, there's examples of strongly negative attitudes towards them, where they're seen as a burden and seen as spreading disease and taking jobs. So the Times newspaper, for example, in one article referred to Italian migrants as vermin, so really showing that negative attitude at the time. In terms of impact, there are some quite major impacts from both groups. Your key political impact for German migration is the writing of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, which we already mentioned. Another example would be the formation of the Reuters news agency by the German migrant Paul Reuters. As one of the first major international news agencies, they were often the first to get information from Europe, so that has a big impact on people's political understanding at the time. When it comes to political impact for the Italians, we don't really have any examples of that in our course, but you do see economic impact for both. You get several very successful German businesses. You may have done a few more of these in lessons, but a key example would be General Electric, set up by Hugo Hurst, which becomes one of the biggest companies in Britain, or Schweppes Lemonade, set up by Johann Schwepp, which obviously we still have today. When it comes to the economic impact, it's easy to remember because it's the ice cream businesses set up by Italian migrants like Carlo Gatti. When it comes to the social and cultural impact, we do see quite major impacts here too. The full English breakfast, for example, which is often seen as an iconic meal in Britain, actually comes from German migrants and German delis. Similarly, some of our most famous classical music comes from German migrants who came at this time, for example, Handel. And again, the Italians have quite a big impact socially and culturally. Some really famous artwork from this period, like the paintings of the Pre-Raphaelites, are from Italian artists like Dante Rossetti. And some famous works of literature are also from Italian migrants. So Christina Rossetti, who is Dante Rossetti's sister, was a famous poet at this time. So Jewish migration takes place in every time period of the course. So when in doubt, you can talk about Jewish migrants, but it's a little complicated in the industrial period because we have to balance the experience of Jews who'd come in the early modern period and come in the start of this period, who tended to be Jews from Western Europe, places like Spain and Germany, against the experience of Eastern European Jews, who are the new migrant group at this period, who come in the 1880s. So as I said, it's a little bit complicated because the experience of Jews in Britain in the 1700s and early 1800s is a positive experience, but that is in itself a pull factor for the Eastern European migration that happens later. The push factor for that is very clear. It's anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. So the pull factors include the fact that there's an existing Jewish population in Britain. There is about 65,000 Jewish people in Britain by the 1850s, and they had had quite serious economic success by that time. So specific examples include Nathan Rothschild, who set up Rothschild's Bank. Jews are also seeing much more political rights at this time period, so some of the restrictions in the early modern period are now being removed, so they're allowed to serve on juries, they're allowed to be lawyers, they're allowed to become MPs, and they just have generally more cultural freedom and social acceptance. So the Jewish Free School, which educated Jewish children in London, opened. They were allowed to study at the best universities, Oxford and Cambridge, which they hadn't been allowed to do before. In terms of why there's this mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe, specifically in the 1880s, that's very easy to explain. In Russia and Eastern Europe at that time, there's this sudden increase in violent anti-Semitic attacks by mobs, and that leads to mass migration. We're talking tens of thousands of Jews from Eastern Europe arriving in England, specifically in London. That's why we'll look at our East End case study from the 1880s. So those changes that I've just described that acted as a pull factor for Jewish migration in the later part of this period are also obviously examples of positive experiences and improving experiences at that time for Jews from Western Europe who were already here from the beginning of this time period. However, when we look specifically at Eastern European migration from the 1880s, they have very, very negative experiences. Many moved to Whitechapel in the East End, where there were very poor living conditions, which we'll look at in more detail when we look at that case study. The main trades they're involved in are clothing and shoemaking and furniture, but lots of them are working in sweatshops, which have very poor conditions and poor pay. And there's very severe anti-Semitic attitudes, and those anti-Semitic attitudes actually get worse in response to the mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe in the 1880s. So all those negative stereotypes that we've seen previously, accused of taking jobs, lowering wages, and causing crime, we still see them in this time period, and in some ways they get even worse. One group that's formed at this time specifically in response to Jewish migration is the British Brothers League, which was a very anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant group, literally set up to try and intimidate and discourage Eastern European migration. We also see, because of those increased anti-immigrant views, the government starting to restrict immigration to Britain for the first time. So the Aliens Act of 1905 is the first law that properly restricts migration to Britain, and it's literally in response to that mass migration of Eastern European Jews from the 1880s that they want to stop from happening and stop from happening again. So we're going to specifically look at our second case studies. There's two case studies in this period, Liverpool and the East End of London. This is largely recapping a lot of what I've just said, but specifically looking at the East End. We know the cause of migration is the anti-Semitic violence in Russia, and that leads to about 90,000 Jews migrating to Whitechapel and the East End. And that huge number of migrants in that very short period of time to one quite small area leads to massive backlash. So the experience in the East End is highly negative, especially because Eastern European Jews tended to arrive very, very poor. They were unskilled at work that Britain needed done, and they were often unable to speak English. Most of them would only speak Yiddish or maybe Russian. And this meant it's much harder for them to be accepted, and they mainly faced negative social attitudes and had difficult lives. If you think of some of the other examples, when migrant groups come that are very skilled and very rich and very economically successful, that often tends to lead to acceptance. If you look at the German migrants in this period, if you look at the Huguenots from the early modern period, if you look at the Flemish weavers from the medieval period, if they integrate and they are bringing economic success, there tends to be acceptance. But in this case, because they're not integrating and they're not contributing much to the economy, at least at first, there's much less acceptance. So we see their housing is incredibly poor quality. They're living in highly overcrowded slums. We're talking about 14 people sharing one room. The work that they have is very poor pay, very poor conditions, often working in sweatshops making textiles and clothing. And the attitudes towards them, as we've said, are highly negative. They're seen as taking jobs, they're seen as spreading diseases. The sweatshops in particular are seen as undercutting businesses. That means taking customers away from other businesses. The fact that they work for very low pay is seen as lowering wages, and they're generally blamed for causing crime. And the most famous example we have for this in the East End is how Jews are blamed for, or some people blame them for, the Jack the Ripper murders. Now, I'm sure lots of you will have heard of these, but in 1881, 5 women are murdered in Whitechapel, which is in the East End. To this day, we don't really know who Jack the Ripper was, but some people at the time claimed that he was Jewish, and that leads to even worse anti-Semitism in Whitechapel and in the East End, as Jewish people were accused of or blamed of that crime. Despite their very negative experiences, obviously so many Jews migrating to one area is going to have a major impact. So we definitely see an economic impact from Jewish businesses being set up in the area. We see the sweatshops affecting the textile industry. We also see specific businesses being created like the Russian vapor baths, which were on Brick Lane. There's social impact, especially because charities are formed to help the poor in the area. Lots of these are formed by richer Jews to help poorer Jews. So the Industrial Dwelling Company created better housing in the area. The Board of Guardians for the Relief of the Jewish Poor was set up. The Jewish Free School, which had been in a different part of London, was moved to this area because the Jewish population is around 40% in this area compared to 1% in other parts of the country. However, we also see, because of this mass migration, because of so many people moving to one area at once, there is a sharp increase in anti-Semitism, as mentioned previously, with groups like the British Brothers League formed, and that means that there is also a political impact, because those negative attitudes led to the passing of the Aliens Act, which limited what they called undesirable migration. So it prevented anyone who had a disease, or anyone who had a criminal record, or anyone who couldn't prove they had a job opportunity or money, then not allowed to migrate into Britain after the Aliens Act. So despite the negative experiences and despite the anti-Semitism, we do see still major impact of Jewish migration at this time, both from Western European Jewish migration from the beginning of the period and from Eastern European Jewish migration at the end of the period. There's definitely a massive economic impact, as already mentioned. Places like Rothschild's Bank are set up, which have a huge economic impact on finance and banking. We get several men's clothing companies started by Jewish migrants, for example, Moss Brothers, Burton, both of which still exist today. Most memorable for lots of my students is that Michael Marks created Marks and Spencer's, again one of Britain's biggest, most famous companies, something again we still have today, so showing that major economic impact. Also, those sweatshops and textile industry in Whitechapel and the East End. We also see political impact at this time. We see the first Jewish mayor of London during this period. We see the first Jewish MP. And like I mentioned earlier, consider how you compare these different groups. We see our first Jewish MPs in this period, our first Indian MPs in this period, our first Irish MPs in this period. So really starting to have that political impact on government. Socially, big impact when it comes to food and drink is the creation of fish and chips, which can be traced back to a Jewish restaurant that was set up in this period. And as already mentioned, that charity work in the East End to help the poorest people in society is an example of the social impact of Jews in this period. So as ever, I really encourage you to think about the big themes of the course. This is a breadth study, so especially for the 16-mark questions, you need to be able to compare different groups within time periods and across different time periods. So the big themes of industrial migration when it comes to the causes of migration, I would definitely say are religion. We see Irish people migrating to escape Catholic persecution. We see Jewish migrants, or at least Eastern European Jews, coming in the 1880s to escape that anti-Semitic violence. When it comes to politics, if we look at freedom as a general factor, that's definitely attracting African migration in the sense of freedom from enslavement, but it's also attracting Irish migration in that they can have political freedom from the Act of Union, from Catholic emancipation. It's also attracting Jewish migration at this time because Jews can be MPs, they can be lawyers, they can be on juries in a way that they weren't previously. And as mentioned, if you look at the example of Karl Marx, one of the reasons he comes to Britain from Germany is that increased political freedom. Another really important factor to consider at this time is changes to the British Empire and how they affect migration. So the colonization of Africa is going to link to increased African migration. As mentioned already, the colonization of Hong Kong and China and the official takeover of India are changes to the empire that increase Asian migration. When it comes to war and conflict, you probably see more examples of that in the modern period with World War I and World War II and the modern wars of the 80s, 90s and 2000s. But obviously you are seeing violence towards Jewish migrants at this time, and you are seeing violence in Germany and Italy over unification, so it is still a factor here. As I keep saying again and again, the economy is always your big factor that you can talk about for pretty much any time period, and especially in this period when the Industrial Revolution is going on, any one of these groups might be migrating because England has many, many jobs in factories, many, many business opportunities with the new technology of the Industrial Revolution. And there are always specific factors that are just worth remembering. You could probably still write whole paragraphs on these. Irish potato famine, especially because it leads to 2 million people migrating, which is one of the largest migrations we see in the whole course. And then it doesn't really fit in any of the other categories. The Italians migrating to avoid diseases is also a factor in this time. When it comes to experience, your basic understanding of experience is basically, is it positive, is it negative, or is it a mixture of both? The only group that we see that seems sort of genuinely overall positive is Germans. They're largely accepted and very economically successful. When it comes to negative experiences, there's definitely a lot more examples of those, unfortunately. The Irish have a very negative experience, but even then, if you look at some of the specific examples from Liverpool, we do see some economic and political success. We do see Irish MPs, Irish businessmen. So there is all the negative stuff about very poor working and living conditions and very poor social attitudes towards them. But there are still those individual examples of success. Everyone else we're seeing largely mixed experience. Africans do have the positive experience of improvement in abolition, and there are, as we see with Ignatius Sancho, for example, individual examples of economic and political success, but there's also a lot of black people in poverty in Britain at this time. Similarly, with Asian migration, we see those examples of Indian MPs in this time period, but there's also lots of Lascars and Ayers that are living in poverty. Italian migrants, we do see economic success with the ice cream businesses, but we also see negative social attitudes with them referred to as vermin. Jewish migration. If you're looking at Jewish migration in the whole of this period, there is some really positive improvements, being able to be MPs, lots of examples of successful businesses. However, if we're looking specifically at Eastern European Jewish experiences in Whitechapel in the East End, those are very, very negatives: slum conditions, sweatshops, negative social attitudes. When it comes to the themes of migration and impact, how they change a country, your basic categories are always political, economic, and social. They might phrase it slightly differently in the exam, but those are reliable categories to come back to. Irish migrants, we see political figures at this time like Fergus O'Connor, who was an MP, a Chartist. We see Africans making huge contributions to the abolition movement, as well as people like William Caffey for the Chartist movement. We see our first Jewish MPs at this time. We see our first Indian MPs at the end of this period. So clear political impact. Economic, Irish migrants contribute through the creation of businesses in Liverpool and their manual labour on railways, canals, etc. German migrants set up many successful businesses, Schweppes, General Electric. Italian migrants also set up businesses like the ice cream businesses. Jewish migrants also set up businesses at this time, Marks and Spencer's for example. Asian migrants also setting up businesses, especially in Liverpool, also contributing manual labour to the building of railways, canals, etc. So definitely clear economic impact at this time. Social impact, again, especially in the case studies, we really see that Irish impact on Liverpool, the Scouse accent, on social attitudes, Italian impacts on culture and art, Jewish impacts through charity work, through fish and chips. As ever, I'll leave you with some practice questions that you might want to work your way through. The ones in black are practice questions exclusively about the industrial period that you can do from this video alone. The ones in blue are just a couple of examples of questions that go across different time periods. So if you've revised your medieval, early modern, or modern periods as well, you can have a go at some of those more difficult practice questions that combine different periods. I'd really encourage you to push yourself to try those ones because it will really get you think about the whole course. And like I said, those themes and those comparisons between different groups and different periods, because as a breadth study, that's what this migration paper is all about.